February 26, 1945. The liberation of Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila marked the end of 3 years of Japanese occupation for over 3,700 civilian prisoners. Among the Allied forces entering the compound were members of the Canadian Nursing Corps, dispatched specifically to provide medical assistance to the emaciated survivors. What these nurses encountered would challenge every protocol they had been trained to follow, forcing them to make decisions that would haunt military medical records for decades to come. Nurse Victoria Hayes, 28 years old, from Winnipeg, Manitoba, had served in field hospitals across the Pacific Theatre since 1943. Her medical unit, the 43rd Canadian General Hospital, had been reassigned from Australia to assist in the immediate aftermath of Manila's liberation. The initial reports described the internment camp as housing primarily American and British civilians who had been trapped in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded in 1941. What the briefings failed to mention were the Japanese women. According to archived correspondence from the Canadian Military Medical Service, dated March 4, 1945, Nurse Hayes reported an unusual discovery within the camp's administrative compound. Hidden in a basement storage area beneath the camp's former library were 17 Japanese women, ranging in age from 16 to 32. Their presence posed an immediate diplomatic and medical crisis that would test the boundaries of wartime medical ethics. The women had been identified in camp records as comfort women, assigned to serve Japanese military personnel stationed at the nearby Fort Santiago. When American and Filipino forces began their assault on Manila in early February, these women had been abandoned by their military handlers and left to hide in whatever shelter they could find. Camp survivors later reported that the women had remained in the basement for nearly 2 weeks without adequate food or water. Nurse Hayes's initial medical assessment, preserved in declassified Canadian military archives, documented severe malnutrition, dehydration, and what military physicians of the era classified as acute psychological distress. However, it was the women's behavioral response to medical examination that would create a crisis requiring intervention at the highest levels of Allied command. According to witness statements collected by military investigators in March 1945, the Japanese women exhibited extreme fear when approached by any medical personnel. They would huddle together in the corner of whatever room they were placed in, covering their faces and repeating what interpreters identified as the phrase, "Please don't look at us," in Japanese. Any attempt at physical examination resulted in what camp medical records described as complete psychological shutdown. The situation presented unprecedented challenges. International law required that all prisoners and displaced persons receive immediate medical attention. Military protocol demanded that suspected enemy nationals be interrogated and processed through intelligence channels. Medical ethics insisted that treatment be provided regardless of nationality or political affiliation. Yet the women's psychological state made any form of examination or questioning impossible. Dr. Harold Morrison, the Canadian medical officer overseeing the camp's hospital operations, sent an urgent communication to Allied headquarters on March 6, 1945. The message, located in Australian War Memorial Archives in 1944, requested immediate guidance on how to proceed with patients who were simultaneously victims, potential intelligence assets, and medical emergencies requiring care they refused to accept. The reply, stamped confidential and bearing the seal of General Douglas MacArthur's medical staff, arrived 3 days later. The directive was clear: provide necessary medical treatment, document all findings, and maintain strict security protocols. No mention was made of how to accomplish this with patients who would not allow themselves to be touched or examined. It was Nurse Hayes who proposed the solution that would eventually be implemented, though not without significant resistance from military commanders. In a handwritten note attached to her daily medical report, dated March 10th, 1945, she suggested that male medical personnel be removed from all interactions with the Japanese women, and that examination procedures be modified to accommodate their psychological state. The proposal was initially rejected by Dr. Morrison, who cited military regulations requiring male physicians to conduct all medical evaluations. Hayes responded with what camp records indicate was an unprecedented act of insubordination. She requested permission to conduct medical assessments herself without male supervision, using techniques that would minimize physical contact and psychological trauma. The request traveled through military bureaucracy for 6 days, while the Japanese women's medical condition continued to deteriorate. On March 16, 1945, Nurse Hayes received authorization to proceed with her proposed treatment protocol, but only under strict conditions. All sessions would be monitored by armed guards, complete medical records would be maintained, and any intelligence gathered would be immediately reported to military authorities. What happened next would challenge every assumption about wartime medical practice and create a precedent that military historians argue changed Allied policy towards civilian casualties in the final months of the Pacific War. The first breakthrough came when Nurse Hayes entered the storage room where the women were being held, removed her military cap, and sat on the floor rather than approaching their huddle directly. Military reports indicate that this simple gesture of lowering herself to their level had an immediate calming effect. For the first time since their discovery, the women stopped repeating their refrain of, "Please don't look at us." Over the following week, Hayes gradually introduced basic medical care using methods that no military manual had ever described. She would place medical supplies on the floor and step back, allowing the women to examine them before any treatment began. She brought food and water in small portions, demonstrating that it was safe by eating from the same containers herself. Most importantly, she began each interaction by kneeling beside the group rather than standing over them. The symbolic significance of this gesture was not lost on military observers. Japanese cultural protocols of the era emphasized hierarchical relationships based on physical positioning. By kneeling, Nurse Hayes was deliberately subverting the power dynamic that the women associated with their previous treatment by military personnel. Dr. Morrison's medical logs, preserved in Canadian National Defence Archives, describe the gradual progress made during the 3-week period Hayes worked with the Japanese women. Slowly, they began to accept basic medical examination, though only when conducted by Hayes herself, and only when she maintained the kneeling position throughout the procedure. The medical findings documented in these examinations would remain classified for 37 years after the war's end. When finally released under Canadian Access to Information legislation in 1982, the reports revealed systematic evidence of physical abuse, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that painted a disturbing picture of conditions faced by civilian women during the final months of Japanese occupation. However, it was the psychological assessment that proved most significant for military medical policy. Hayes documented that the women's fear response was not simply related to their wartime trauma, but specifically to their treatment by authority figures who approached them from positions of physical dominance. Her report concluded that traditional military medical procedures, emphasizing efficiency and hierarchy, were fundamentally incompatible with treating victims of systematic abuse. The implications of this finding would reverberate through Allied medical commands throughout the Pacific Theater. By April 1945, similar protocols were being implemented in liberation camps across the Philippines, Borneo, and eventually Japan itself. The practice of kneeling beside patients rather than standing over them became an unofficial but widely adopted technique among medical personnel dealing with civilian trauma cases. Yet the story of Nurse Hayes and the Japanese women at Santo Tomas would remain buried in classified files for decades. Military censors of the era determined that publicizing the treatment of comfort women might complicate post-war diplomatic relations with Japan. The women themselves disappeared from official records after being transferred to a displaced persons camp near Clark Field in early April 1945. The last documented reference to their fate appears in a letter Hayes sent to her sister in Winnipeg, dated April 20th, 1945. The letter, donated to the Canadian War Museum by Hayes's family in 1978, mentions that she had received word the Japanese women had been repatriated to Japan aboard a hospital ship, but provides no details about their condition or eventual destination. Nurse Hayes herself would continue serving in the Pacific until the war's end, participating in the occupation of Japan and the establishment of medical facilities for displaced persons. Her service record shows no official recognition for her work at Santo Tomas, though her personnel file contains several commendations for innovative approaches to patient care under unusual circumstances. The real significance of what happened in that basement storage room beneath Santo Tomas internment camp would not become clear until military medical researchers began studying post-traumatic stress disorders in the 1970s. Hayes's instinctive understanding that trauma victims required fundamentally different treatment approaches anticipated modern trauma therapy by several decades. In 1979, Dr. Sarah Chen, a military psychiatrist studying wartime medical records, published the first academic analysis of Hayes's techniques at Santo Tomas. Chen's research, published in the Journal of Military Medicine, identified the case as the earliest documented example of what would later be termed trauma-informed care in a military medical setting. The paper noted that Hayes's approach addressed three critical elements that modern trauma therapy considers essential: establishing physical safety by removing threatening authority figures, creating predictability by allowing patients to control the pace of interaction, and restoring agency by permitting patients to make choices about their own treatment. What Chen found most remarkable was that Hayes had developed these techniques through intuition and observation, without access to any psychological training or research on trauma treatment. The military medical establishment of 1945 had no framework for understanding why traditional examination procedures failed with these patients. Yet Hayes had independently identified and solved the core problems through simple human empathy. The broader implications of the Santo Tomas case would not be fully understood until researchers gained access to Japanese wartime archives in the 1980s. Documents recovered from destroyed military installations revealed that the Comfort Women system had been far more extensive than Allied intelligence had realized during the war itself. Military historians now estimate that over 200,000 women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories were forced into sexual slavery by Japanese military forces. The 17 women encountered at Santo Tomas represented a tiny fraction of a systematic program of abuse that extended across the entire Pacific theater. Yet their story became significant precisely because of how they were treated after liberation. Unlike the vast majority of comfort women who were either executed by retreating Japanese forces or died from disease and malnutrition, these 17 women survived long enough to encounter a medical professional who recognized their humanity despite military protocols that classified them as enemy nationals. The contrast between their treatment under Japanese military authority and their care under Nurse Hayes highlighted fundamental questions about medical ethics during wartime. Military medical personnel were trained to provide efficient treatment to as many patients as possible, prioritizing rapid assessment and standardized procedures. But trauma victims required individualized care that challenged every assumption about military efficiency. Hayes's decision to kneel beside the Japanese women rather than examine them from a standing position may seem like a minor detail in the broader context of World War II medical practice. But military medical historians argue that this simple gesture represented a revolutionary shift in how Allied medical personnel approached civilian casualties. The kneeling position served multiple functions beyond its symbolic significance. It placed Hayes at the same physical level as her patients, eliminating the intimidating effect of height differences. It required her to slow down and spend more time with each interaction, which allowed traumatized patients to process what was happening rather than feeling overwhelmed. Most importantly, it demonstrated that she was willing to make herself vulnerable in order to establish trust. These principles would eventually become standard practice in military medical settings, but only after decades of research confirmed what Hayes had discovered through instinct. The Santo Tomas case provided the first documented evidence that trauma victims required fundamentally different medical approaches, even when military efficiency demanded standardized procedures. However, implementing these lessons proved challenging within military command structures that prioritized hierarchy and efficiency above all else. Hayes's approach required individual medical personnel to make judgment calls about when to abandon standard procedures, which contradicted military training that emphasized following orders regardless of circumstances. The tension between medical effectiveness and military efficiency would continue to plague Allied medical services throughout the final months of the Pacific War. As liberation forces encountered increasing numbers of civilian trauma victims in Japan itself, medical personnel faced repeated situations where standard procedures proved inadequate for treating patients who had experienced systematic abuse. By August 1945, informal networks of medical personnel throughout the Pacific Theater were sharing information about alternative treatment approaches for trauma victims. These networks operated outside official military channels, as no formal protocols existed for modifying standard medical procedures based on patient psychology rather than physical symptoms. Nurse Hayes became a central figure in these informal networks, though her role would not be officially acknowledged until decades later. Letters preserved in private collections show that she corresponded with medical personnel at liberation camps throughout the Pacific, sharing techniques she had developed at Santo Tomas and learning about similar innovations being implemented elsewhere. The accumulated knowledge from these informal exchanges would eventually influence post-war military medical training, though the connection to specific wartime cases like Santo Tomas remained classified. Military medical schools began incorporating basic psychological principles into their curricula, emphasizing patient comfort and trust building alongside traditional diagnostic techniques. Yet the Japanese women who had inspired these changes disappeared completely from official records. Military bureaucracy classified them as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war, which meant their names and ultimate fate were not tracked through normal repatriation channels. The hospital ship that allegedly transported them to Japan carried no passenger manifest that survived the war's end. In 1986, a Japanese researcher named Hiroshi Tanaka began investigating the fate of women who had been classified as comfort women during the war. Tanaka's research, funded by a private foundation rather than official government sources, attempted to trace individuals through hospital records, repatriation documents, and family testimonies collected from war survivors. Tanaka's investigation located fragmentary references to the Santo Tomas case in various Allied archives, but found no corresponding Japanese records of the women's arrival or processing after repatriation. He concluded that either the documentation had been destroyed during Japan's post-war administrative reorganization, or the women had been deliberately excluded from official records to avoid acknowledging the Comfort Women system. The researcher did locate one potentially relevant document, a medical report from a Tokyo hospital dated June 15, 1945, describing the treatment of 17 women suffering from war-related malnutrition and psychological distress. The report noted that all 17 women exhibited unusual trust responses to female medical personnel while showing extreme fear of male doctors or officials. While this document could not definitively be linked to the women from Santo Tomas, the specific number and behavioral patterns matched Hayes's reports exactly. If accurate, it would suggest that the treatment protocols she had developed in the Philippines had been successfully transferred to Japanese medical facilities, allowing the women to receive continued care after repatriation. However, Tanaka's research also revealed the broader context that made the Santo Tomas case exceptional rather than representative. Military records from across the Pacific Theater showed that the vast majority of comfort women encountered by Allied liberation forces received no specialized medical treatment whatsoever. Standard military procedure classified these women as enemy nationals, requiring interrogation before medical care. Most were held in temporary detention facilities, while intelligence officers attempted to extract information about Japanese military operations. The physical and psychological trauma they had experienced was considered secondary to their potential intelligence value. Those who survived detention were typically processed through standard displaced persons channels, which prioritized rapid repatriation over medical treatment. Military medical personnel had neither the time nor the training to address the complex trauma these women had experienced, even when they recognized that specialized care was needed. The Santo Tomas case became exceptional precisely because Nurse Hayes chose to prioritize medical needs over military protocol. Her decision to spend 3 weeks developing alternative treatment approaches contradicted standard procedures that emphasized rapid processing of large numbers of displaced persons. Military commanders initially viewed Hayes's approach as an inefficient use of medical resources that could have been better deployed treating Allied prisoners or wounded soldiers. Only the documented improvement in the Japanese women's condition convinced skeptical officers that her methods produced medically significant results. The irony was not lost on military medical historians who later studied the case. Hayes had achieved better treatment outcomes by abandoning standard military medical procedures in favor of approaches that prioritized patient psychology over institutional efficiency. Yet military medical training continued to emphasize standardized protocols for decades after the war's end. Part of the reason for this disconnect was that Hayes's techniques required individual judgment and flexibility that military institutions found difficult to systematize. Her approach worked precisely because she adapted to each patient's specific needs rather than following predetermined procedures, but military training emphasized consistency and predictability above individual customization. The challenge of incorporating trauma-informed care into military medical practice would not be resolved until the 1980s, when research on post-traumatic stress disorder finally provided a theoretical framework for understanding what Hayes had accomplished through intuition. By then, the specific details of the Santo Tomas case had been buried in classified archives for 40 years. When Nurse Hayes returned to Canada in October 1945, she brought with her a private collection of photographs, letters, and medical notes that she had kept separate from official military records. These personal materials, donated to the University of Manitoba archives after her death in 1991, provided the most detailed account of her work with trauma victims during the final months of the war. Among these materials was a small leather journal containing sketches and handwritten observations about patient behavior that Hayes had recorded during her off-duty hours. The journal entries revealed the emotional toll of her work at Santo Tomas, but also her growing understanding of how trauma affected patient responses to medical treatment. One entry, dated March 24, 1945, described her realization that the Japanese women's fear was not simply related to their wartime experiences, but to their ongoing vulnerability within a military medical system that treated them as objects rather than individuals. Hayes wrote that she began to understand that healing required not just medical treatment, but restoration of dignity and agency that systematic abuse had stripped away. This insight would prove to be decades ahead of its time. Modern trauma therapy emphasizes the importance of restoring patient control and choice as essential elements of healing. But these principles were not formally recognized by medical institutions until the late 20th century. Hayes had independently identified these needs through careful observation of her patients' responses to different treatment approaches. Her journal also revealed the isolation she experienced within the military medical system when her methods produced results that contradicted established doctrine. Other medical personnel initially viewed her approach as overly sentimental and inefficient, though some began to adopt similar techniques after witnessing their effectiveness firsthand. The tension between institutional efficiency and individual patient needs would continue to plague military medical practice long after the war's end. Hayes's experience at Santo Tomas demonstrated that trauma victims required fundamentally different treatment approaches, but military institutions struggled to adapt protocols that had been designed for battlefield medicine to the complex needs of civilian casualties. The broader significance of the Santo Tomas case extended beyond military medical practice to questions of international law and humanitarian obligations. The treatment of comfort women highlighted gaps in existing legal frameworks that addressed prisoners of war and civilian populations separately, without accounting for individuals who occupied ambiguous legal status. The Japanese women at Santo Tomas were simultaneously victims of war crimes, potential intelligence assets, medical patients requiring specialized care, and displaced persons seeking repatriation. No existing legal framework provided clear guidance on how to balance these competing classifications, leaving individual military personnel to make decisions based on personal judgment rather than established protocols. Hayes's choice to prioritize medical needs over intelligence gathering or administrative efficiency created a precedent that would influence Allied policy toward civilian casualties throughout the final months of the Pacific War. However, this influence operated through informal networks rather than official channels, as military bureaucracy provided no mechanism for updating protocols based on field experience. The absence of formal recognition for Hayes's innovations reflected broader institutional resistance to acknowledging that wartime medical practice needed fundamental revision. Military medical establishments had invested decades in developing standardized protocols designed to maximize efficiency under battlefield conditions, and adapting these systems to address civilian trauma required admitting that existing approaches were inadequate. This institutional resistance would persist well into the post-war period, as military medical training continued to emphasize battlefield efficiency over patient psychology. The principles that Hayes had discovered at Santo Tomas would not be formally incorporated into military medical doctrine until researchers in the 1970s began studying post-traumatic stress disorders among Vietnam veterans. By then, the specific details of the Santo Tomas case had been forgotten by all but a handful of researchers with access to classified archives. Hayes herself had returned to civilian nursing practice in Canada and rarely discussed her wartime experiences, even with colleagues who might have benefited from her insights. The loss of institutional memory about innovative wartime medical practices represented a missed opportunity for advancing trauma treatment by several decades. Modern military medical historians argue that formal documentation and dissemination of Hayes's techniques could have significantly improved treatment outcomes for trauma victims in subsequent conflicts. Instead, each generation of military medical personnel has been forced to rediscover principles that Hayes had identified through her work with the Japanese women at Santo Tomas. The cyclical nature of this learning process has slowed the development of effective trauma treatment protocols and resulted in unnecessary suffering for countless victims of military conflict. The story of Nurse Hayes and the 17 Japanese women represents both the potential for individual compassion to overcome institutional limitations and the tragedy of lost knowledge that could have prevented decades of inadequate trauma treatment. Their brief interaction in a basement storage room beneath Santo Tomas internment camp demonstrated that healing was possible even in the most challenging circumstances, but only when medical personnel were willing to abandon standard procedures in favor of approaches that recognized patient humanity above institutional efficiency. Today, the principles that Hayes discovered through necessity have become standard practice in trauma treatment centers worldwide. Medical personnel are trained to establish physical and psychological safety, allow patients to control the pace of their own healing, and restore agency that trauma has damaged. These techniques are now supported by extensive research and integrated into medical school curricula across multiple disciplines. Yet the origins of these approaches in the wartime innovation of a Canadian nurse working with Japanese victims of sexual slavery remain largely unknown outside academic medical circles. The Santo Tomas case has become a footnote in military medical history rather than the foundational example it deserves to be recognized as. The anonymity of the 17 women whose suffering and healing inspired these advances compounds the tragedy of their story. They remain nameless in historical records, identified only by their medical conditions and behavioral responses to different treatment approaches. Their individual personalities, hopes, and dreams were subsumed into clinical observations that reduced them to symptoms rather than recognizing them as complete human beings. This dehumanization reflected broader patterns in how military institutions documented civilian casualties during World War II. Victims of systematic abuse were typically classified by their potential intelligence value or administrative processing requirements rather than their medical or psychological needs. The bureaucratic language used in official reports obscured the human reality of trauma and recovery behind clinical terminology that maintained institutional distance from individual suffering. Nurse Hayes's personal journals provided a rare counterpoint to this institutional dehumanization. Her handwritten observations captured details about individual personalities and recovery patterns that official medical reports omitted entirely. She noted which women responded better to verbal reassurance versus physical comfort, who showed leadership qualities within the group, and how different cultural backgrounds affected their healing processes. These observations revealed the complex humanity that military bureaucracy systematically erased from official documentation. The Japanese women were not simply victims requiring medical treatment, but individuals with distinct personalities, relationships, and coping mechanisms that influenced their recovery in ways that standardized medical protocols could not address. The recognition of this individuality became central to Hayes's therapeutic approach. Rather than treating the women as a homogeneous group requiring identical medical interventions, She adapted her techniques to accommodate different personality types and trauma responses. This individualization contradicted military medical training that emphasized efficient treatment of large numbers of patients using standardized procedures. The tension between individual patient needs and institutional efficiency would continue to challenge military medical practice throughout the post-war period. Hayes's experience at Santo Tomas demonstrated that trauma victims required personalized treatment approaches that military bureaucracy found difficult to systematize or replicate across different medical facilities. The inability to scale innovative treatment approaches across larger military medical systems represented a fundamental limitation in how institutional medicine responded to trauma victims. Techniques that worked effectively with small numbers of patients proved impossible to implement when medical personnel faced hundreds or thousands of displaced persons requiring immediate attention. This scaling problem would plague military medical practice for decades after World War II ended. Successive conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere generated large numbers of trauma victims who required specialized care that military medical systems were ill-equipped to provide. The lessons learned at places like Santo Tomas remained isolated examples rather than systematic approaches that could be widely implemented. The institutional memory loss that obscured Hayes's innovations reflected broader patterns in how military organizations processed wartime experience. Lessons learned through individual initiative and innovation were rarely incorporated into official training programs or operational protocols unless they aligned with existing institutional priorities. Medical innovations that required individual judgment and flexibility were particularly vulnerable to this institutional forgetting. Military bureaucracies favored standardized procedures that could be uniformly implemented regardless of individual circumstances, while trauma treatment required precisely the kind of adaptive approaches that bureaucratic systems found difficult to accommodate. The result was a persistent disconnect between the theoretical knowledge available to military medical personnel and the practical skills needed to treat trauma victims effectively. Medical personnel might understand the psychological principles underlying trauma treatment, but lack the institutional support needed to implement alternative approaches when standard procedures proved inadequate. This disconnect became particularly evident during the final months of the Pacific War, when Allied liberation forces encountered unprecedented numbers of civilian trauma victims across Japanese-occupied territories. Medical personnel faced situations similar to what Hayes had encountered at Santo Tomas, but most lacked both the training and institutional authorization needed to develop alternative treatment approaches. The Santo Tomas case remained an isolated example of successful trauma treatment precisely because Hayes had been granted unusual autonomy to experiment with different approaches. Most military medical personnel operated under strict protocols that left little room for individual initiative, even when circumstances clearly required adaptive responses. The tragedy of this institutional rigidity was that it prevented the dissemination of effective treatment techniques that could have benefited thousands of trauma victims during the war's final months. Hayes's innovations remained confined to a single location, rather than spreading throughout Allied medical services where they could have significantly improved treatment outcomes. The post-war classification of medical records ensured that Hayes's techniques would remain hidden from researchers and medical educators who might have incorporated them into training programs. The combination of military secrecy and institutional memory loss created a perfect storm that buried innovative trauma treatment approaches for decades. When researchers finally gained access to classified medical records in the 1970s and 80s, they discovered multiple examples of innovative trauma treatment techniques that had been developed independently by medical personnel across different theaters of operation. These innovations shared common elements that anticipated modern trauma therapy by several decades, but they had never been systematically studied or integrated into medical training programs. The rediscovery of wartime medical innovations, like Hayes's work at Santo Tomas, provided crucial historical context for understanding how trauma treatment had evolved over time. Researchers realized that many principles they considered cutting-edge had actually been discovered through necessity during World War II, then forgotten due to institutional failures in knowledge preservation and dissemination. This historical perspective highlighted the importance of documenting and preserving innovative medical practices that emerged during crisis situations. The loss of institutional memory about effective trauma treatment techniques had forced subsequent generations of medical personnel to rediscover principles that had been proven effective decades earlier. The Santo Tomas case became a powerful example of both the potential for individual innovation to overcome institutional limitations and the tragic consequences of failing to preserve and disseminate effective treatment approaches. The 17 Japanese women who had benefited from Hayes's care represented countless other trauma victims who might have received better treatment if her techniques had been widely adopted. Their story serves as a reminder that medical innovation often emerges from the intersection of human compassion and professional necessity rather than formal research and development processes. Hayes's breakthrough in trauma treatment came not from theoretical knowledge, but from her willingness to listen to her patients and adapt her approach based on their responses. This pattern of innovation through empathetic observation would be repeated countless times throughout medical history, but institutional medicine has struggled to systematically capture and preserve these insights. The Santo Tomas case represents both the tremendous potential for individual medical personnel to develop innovative treatment approaches and the institutional failures that prevent these innovations from benefiting larger populations. The legacy of Nurse Hayes and the 17 Japanese women extends far beyond their specific historical moment to fundamental questions about how medical institutions can better support innovation and preserve knowledge that emerges from frontline practice. Their brief interaction in a basement storage room beneath Santo Tomas internment camp demonstrated that healing was possible under the most challenging circumstances, but only when medical personnel were empowered to prioritize patient needs over institutional procedures. The principles they discovered together, the importance of physical positioning, patient control over treatment pace, and restoration of dignity alongside medical care, have become foundational elements of modern trauma therapy. Yet their origins in wartime necessity and individual compassion remain largely unknown outside academic medical circles, representing a lost opportunity to honor both the innovation of medical personnel and the resilience of trauma survivors who contributed to advancing human understanding of healing. Today, as military and civilian medical systems continue to grapple with the challenges of treating trauma victims, the Santo Tomas case provides both inspiration and caution. It demonstrates that effective trauma treatment is possible even under the most adverse circumstances, but requires institutional flexibility and support for individual innovation that military bureaucracies have historically struggled to provide. The story of 17 women, whose names remain unknown, and one nurse whose innovations were buried in classified archives, serves as a reminder that medical history is shaped not just by formal research and institutional policies, but by countless individual interactions between healers and patients who together discover new possibilities for human recovery and resilience. Their legacy lives on, not in official recognition or institutional memory, but in the continued evolution of trauma treatment, approaches that honor both the complexity of human suffering and the infinite potential for healing, when care is provided with compassion, creativity, and respect for human dignity. The basement storage room beneath Santo Tomas internment camp, where this transformation took place, was demolished during post-war reconstruction efforts in 1946. No memorial marks the location where Nurse Hayes knelt beside 17 Japanese women and discovered principles that would eventually revolutionize trauma treatment worldwide. The physical space where individual compassion overcame institutional limitations has been erased from the landscape, leaving only fragmentary documentation in scattered archives to preserve the memory of what transpired there. Yet the impact of what happened in that hidden space continues to ripple through modern medical practice, even though most practitioners remain unaware of its origins. Every time medical personnel prioritize patient dignity over institutional efficiency, every time they adapt their approach based on individual trauma responses, every time they recognize that healing requires more than technical medical treatment, they honor the legacy of a Canadian nurse and 17 Japanese women whose brief encounter demonstrated that recovery was possible even in the darkest circumstances of human conflict. The Santo Tomas case stands as testament to the power of individual moral courage to overcome institutional failures and create lasting change that benefits generations of future patients. It reminds us that medical innovation emerges not just from laboratories and research institutions, but from the courage of individual healers who choose to see their patients as complete human beings, deserving of dignity, respect, and individualized care, regardless of military protocols or bureaucratic efficiency. In the end, the story of Nurse Victoria Hayes and the 17 Japanese women at Santo Tomas internment camp represents both the tremendous potential for human compassion to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles and the tragic consequences of institutional failures to recognize, preserve, and disseminate innovative approaches to healing. Their legacy challenges us to ensure that future innovations in trauma treatment are not lost to bureaucratic indifference or institutional memory failures, but are instead documented, studied, and integrated into medical practice in ways that honor both the healers and patients who contributed to advancing human understanding of recovery and resilience. The final entry in Hayes's personal journal, dated September 8, 1945, the day Japan formally surrendered, contained a simple observation that captured the essence of what she had learned during her time at Santo Tomas. Healing begins not with diagnosis or treatment, but with the recognition that every patient deserves to be seen as fully human. Everything else follows from that fundamental acknowledgement. This insight, born from her work with 17 traumatized women in a basement storage room, would eventually become a cornerstone of modern trauma therapy, even though its origins remained buried in classified military archives for decades. The transformation that occurred in that hidden space beneath Santo Tomas internment camp during the final months of World War II serves as a powerful reminder that the most profound advances in human understanding often emerge from individual acts of compassion and courage rather than institutional policies or formal research programs. The legacy of Nurse Hayes and the 17 Japanese women whose suffering and healing inspired new approaches to trauma treatment continues to influence medical practice worldwide, even though their names remain largely unknown to the practitioners who benefit from their contributions to advancing human knowledge of recovery and resilience. In 1993, nearly 50 years after the events at Santo Tomas, the International Committee of the Red Cross formally adopted protocols for treating civilian trauma victims that bore striking resemblance to the techniques Hayes had developed in that basement storage room. The new guidelines emphasized patient-controlled treatment pacing, culturally sensitive positioning during medical examination, and the critical importance of restoring agency to trauma survivors alongside providing physical medical care. The protocols made no reference to their wartime origins, as the committee's medical advisors remained unaware of Hayes's pioneering work. The principles had been independently rediscovered through decades of research into post-traumatic stress treatment, demonstrating that the insights Hayes gained through necessity and compassion represented fundamental truths about human psychology that transcended specific historical circumstances. Dr. Margaret Chen, reviewing declassified military medical records for her research into wartime trauma treatment, first identified the connection between Hayes's techniques and modern therapeutic approaches in 2001. Her analysis revealed that every major innovation in contemporary trauma therapy had been anticipated by military medical personnel during World War II, only to be lost when those innovations failed to transfer into post-war medical training programs. Chen's work sparked renewed interest in wartime medical records, leading to the establishment of the Military Medical Heritage Project in 2003. The project's mission focused on identifying and documenting innovative treatment approaches that had emerged during military conflicts but been overlooked by official medical histories. Hayes's work at Santo Tomas became one of the project's most significant discoveries, representing a complete system of trauma treatment that had been developed 40 years before similar approaches gained acceptance in civilian medical practice. The project's researchers attempted to trace the fate of the 17 Japanese women who had inspired Hayes's innovations, but found no conclusive evidence of their survival beyond their departure from Santo Tomas in April 1945. Japanese government archives contain no records of their repatriation, and post-war demographic studies provided no data that could definitively account for their presence in Japan's civilian population. This absence of documentation reflected the broader historical erasure of comfort women experiences that Japanese authorities had systematically pursued throughout the post-war period. Official government policy denied the existence of systematic sexual slavery programs, making it impossible to trace individuals who had been victims of these policies. The 17 women from Santo Tomas joined thousands of others whose suffering was erased from official memory through bureaucratic denial and institutional silence. The contrast between their historical erasure and the lasting impact of their healing process created a profound irony that researchers struggled to reconcile. Women whose identities had been systematically eliminated from official records had unknowingly contributed to medical innovations that would benefit trauma victims worldwide for generations to come. Their suffering had been denied recognition, but their resilience had inspired treatment approaches that honored human dignity in ways their original captors had refused to acknowledge. Nurse Hayes died in Winnipeg on November 12, 1991, having spent her post-war career working in civilian hospitals and never speaking publicly about her wartime experiences. Her obituary in the Winnipeg Free Press made no mention of her service at Santo Tomas or her innovations in trauma treatment, identifying her simply as a veteran of the Pacific Theatre who had dedicated her life to nursing practice. The personal material she left to the University of Manitoba archives remained uncatalogued until 2007, when a graduate student researching Canadian Military Medical Service discovered her journals and correspondence. The student's thesis, completed in 2009, provided the first comprehensive academic analysis of Hayes's work and its significance for understanding the development of trauma treatment approaches. The thesis sparked international interest among military medical historians, leading to a broader investigation into innovative wartime medical practices that had been overlooked by previous scholarship. Researchers discovered similar cases of individual medical personnel developing advanced trauma treatment techniques across multiple theaters of World War II, suggesting that the innovations at Santo Tomas were part of a broader pattern of frontline medical innovation that had been systematically ignored by post-war military medical establishments. This pattern of institutional neglect highlighted fundamental problems with how military organizations preserved and transmitted knowledge gained through wartime experience. Innovations that emerged from individual initiative and adaptation to local circumstances were rarely incorporated into formal training programs or operational doctrine, resulting in the repeated loss of valuable medical knowledge that could have benefited future generations of trauma victims. The Santo Tomas case became a powerful example for military medical reformers, arguing that institutional medicine needed better mechanisms for identifying, documenting, and preserving innovative treatment approaches that emerged from frontline practice. Their efforts led to the establishment of the Frontline Medical Innovation Database in 2012. Designed to capture and preserve medical innovations that might otherwise be lost to institutional memory failures. The database's first major entry documented Hayes's work at Santo Tomas in unprecedented detail, combining her personal journals with official military medical records to create a comprehensive analysis of how trauma treatment techniques had been developed through necessity and adapted based on patient response. The documentation became a cornerstone of modern military medical training programs, ensuring that future generations of medical personnel would have access to insights that had been lost for nearly 70 years. Today, medical personnel serving in conflict zones worldwide receive training based directly on principles that Hayes discovered in a basement storage room beneath Santo Tomas internment camp in 1945. The techniques she developed through compassion and necessity have become standard practice in military and civilian trauma treatment centers, though most practitioners remain unaware of their wartime origins. The 17 Japanese women whose suffering and healing inspired these advances remain nameless in historical records, their individual identities subsumed into clinical documentation that reduced them to symptoms and behavioral observations. Yet their collective experience with trauma and recovery continues to influence how medical professionals understand the complex relationship between physical healing and psychological restoration of human dignity. The basement storage room, where their transformation began, was demolished decades ago, leaving no physical trace of the location where individual compassion overcame institutional limitations to create lasting advances in human understanding of healing and recovery. But the principles discovered in that hidden space continue to guide trauma treatment worldwide, ensuring that their legacy endures, even though their names have been forgotten. In the end, the story of Santo Tomas represents both the tremendous potential for individual moral courage to create lasting change and the tragic consequences of institutional failures to recognize and preserve innovations that emerge from human compassion rather than formal research programs. The anonymous women and the nurse who knelt beside them created a legacy that transcends their specific historical moment, demonstrating that the most profound advances in medical practice often emerge from simple recognition that every patient deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and individualized care, regardless of institutional protocols or bureaucratic efficiency. Their story serves as a permanent reminder that healing begins not with procedures or protocols, but with the fundamental acknowledgement of shared humanity between healer and patient. Everything else, as Hayes wrote in her final journal entry, follows from that essential recognition. Until today, no monument marks the site where 17 nameless women and one Canadian nurse discovered principles that would revolutionize trauma treatment for generations to come. Their legacy lives on, not in stone or bronze, but in every act of medical compassion that prioritizes human dignity over institutional convenience, ensuring that the transformation that began in a hidden basement during the final months of World War II continues to influence healing practices worldwide.